I really want to thank Keith and Brian for inviting me to come speak to you. I've been doing grazing management research since about 1976 in a lot of different areas, and this was a really great opportunity for me to kind of look back over that career and relate it to things that are going now. As Keith mentioned, I do primarily targeted grazing, which is pretty specific. But I also manage nearly 20,000 acres of rangeland in 5 different ranches spread across west central Texas. So in terms of just practical day-to-day stuff, I'm still quite involved in it. And the topic they asked me to talk about was linking research to management. And I took that to mean, and we didn't have a lot of discussion, but there's still a lot of controversy going on right now about rotational grazing, things that we did research on, that I got my PhD doing research on with Rod Heitschmidt, who many of you may know was up at Miles City. We did that in the 80s. And anyway, so I'm going to talk about all of that stuff. But first off, I want to talk a little, when I got thinking about this, I said, okay, what is this relationship between research and applied management for the different areas of range management? And it really varies. So this is just kind of hypothetical. But if you think about it on a scale of 1 to 10, where a 10 would be 100% agreement and a 0 would be absolutely no agreement, we have things like the basis of our discipline, I would argue, is plant ID. If we can't identify the plants out there, where can we go? There's very little argument about that, right? Now, the taxonomists, they change genuses every once in a while, and the rest of us just call them what we learned, you know, when we were on the judging team or something. But basically, there's no argument about if somebody brings you a western wheatgrass plant, that's what it is, right? And then you move down to the ecological site descriptions. Well, that's pretty similar. It's, you know, what plants grow on what sites. Yeah, there's more argument there about, say, the state transitions, just exactly what's more important, fire, grazing, precipitation, whatever. But again, we kind of know that a given site will go this direction or that direction, and what moves it that way, and what plants should be there, what soils are there. As we move on down, herbicides. Before we ever register one, right, the companies have done a lot of research on them. The land grant schools have done a lot of research on them, and we basically agree, but we don't always apply it because each one of us thinks that if we do it just a little bit different, we're going to get a little bit better kill than somebody else, right? So a little bit less agreement. Revegetation, even more so, I would argue. What species we ought to put out there, when we should plant them, how deep, what drill we're going to use, you know, are we going to broadcast it and harrow it in, all these different things. We get a little bit farther away from the actual applied, or the actual research and how we actually do it. And I would argue that there's many more combinations when we come down to, say, reseeding than there are, say, spraying and so on. Moving on down, I put range hydrology next, and mainly I did that because in Texas we're still arguing about whether controlling brush yields water for municipalities, okay? And so the research basically says no, it doesn't, but the legislature keeps providing money to do it. Animal nutrition. You know, there's always a feed salesman out there going to sell you something new that's going to put a little bit more gain on your animals, and it's actually going to cost you a little bit more too. But he tells you it costs a little bit more, but you get a little bit more out of it, right? And then down at the very bottom, grazing management. Not a lot of agreement on that, really, when you look across, you know, the people that are applying it, the people that are even doing research on it, and that sort of thing. And I would argue that that's because there's just so many different variables in there. And so the possibility of getting a lot of different results is pretty high. Oh, and by the way, if you want to stop me at any time, don't throw me out, but ask questions, why? Go ahead, okay? I mean, you don't have to save until the end. Just stick your hand up and we'll talk about it. Because an hour and a half is a long time to do a monologue. Okay, just a little bit of my background. Like I said, I've been doing this for a few years. So I did my master's work at Colorado State from 76 to 80. You might ask why it took 4 years. I was a slow learner. And it was on complementary grazing. In other words, using improved forages and annual forages such as hay grazer and wheat pasture in combination with rangelands to basically produce forage-fed beef. And so what I have are when, where, the kind of systems, what the objectives were, and what the main reason, whether it was production or restoration. Because that's something that's been kind of, as we look over time, when I started doing research on this, it was all about production. And now I would argue that most of what we do in grazing management is really about restoration or conservation, whatever you want to call it. And the interesting thing about forage-fed beef production is it's come back around again. We're now doing it again 30 years or so later. And the really interesting thing is when I did that research at Colorado State, I can remember, you know, we had these forage-fed animals, we had feedlot animals, and we did meats comparisons on them in addition to everything else. And we did go talk to the meats people about, well, how was that forage-fed beef? And they just kind of, it was terrible, right? They hate that stuff, and they still do. I was talking to some students the other day at Angelo State, and they have a meats lab and everything, and I said, well, this forage-fed beef is getting, you know, a lot of interest these days. What do you think about that? And it was kind of like, well, if you have to have it, I guess it's okay. But if you want a good steak, you're going to feed them some grain. So things have not changed. Okay, then I moved to North Texas, went to work with Rod Heitschmidt at the Texas Experimental Ranch. And we did research on basically short duration grazing. But we compared it to a 3-herd, 4-pasture, and to some continuous grazing systems. The objective was really to look at the stocking rate argument that Savory was making, that you could double stocking rate, okay? People, back then, there wasn't a lot of argument that there were some benefits to rotational grazing, particularly things like the narrow 3-herd, 4-pasture and the high-intensity, low-frequency systems. They provided certain benefits in terms of improving rangelands. But again, the goal was always production. From there, I went to eastern Idaho to U.S. Sheep Experiment Station, and we did targeted grazing and co-species grazing. The main objective was control of invasive species, right? And so it was really primarily restoration. The co-species was more about production, but restoration was really the main topic then. And then finally, in my present position in West Central Texas, in addition to managing a bunch of research herds, which is really production, I don't know how many of you have worked with geneticists, but a geneticist has never had enough animals to really do what he wants to, right? And so stocking rate becomes an issue, and I deal with that a lot. But then we're also working on what we call the super juniper eating goat, and that's we try to breed goats to eat more juniper, to genetically modify them, to have a preference for a plant that we want to control. So that's a little bit of background on me and my experience with grazing management. So what I want to do tonight is talk a little bit about some definitions, talk a little bit about grazing management, grazing systems, a little bit about the history of this grazing as it relates to rotational grazing, and then the whole management issue related to this grazing management. So what's research? Research is a systematic inquiry to describe, explain, and predict the observed phenomena. And I think the critical words are systematic. Okay, we don't just do things randomly. We have to have a plan, a research plan. We have to follow that plan if we want to learn anything, if we want to get an unambiguous answer to the question. And that does put constraints lots of times on how we plan these systems. Statistics is a method of analyzing information so that results from an experimental population can be extended to similar populations. So that puts further constraints on us, okay? basically, we can't just go do a study on one set of animals and say that applies to all of them. We have to know what the variation between different experimental units are, and so that we can then infer to other populations. Again, it just puts other constraints from the research perspective. And I'll just bring this up because when we go to management doesn't have these constraints, okay? And what is management? And I look at it from a business management perspective. And really it is. I mean, grazing management is business management at the end of the day, because you're running a ranch usually, or even if you're doing it targeted grazing to control an invasive species, you have an objective to that business. And that's Peter Drucker, and if you haven't read any of his stuff, you really don't know much about management, because he's really considered the father of management in the 20th century. Anyway, the organization and coordination of activities of a business in order to achieve defined objectives. Management is often included as a factor of production along with machines. In our business, those machines are grazing animals, and materials. In our business, it's the rangeland resources and money or capital. So it's about the machines, the resource, and the capital. That's what management does. I have a problem. We talk a lot about adaptive management, okay? Personally, I consider that redundancy. In other words, using two words that mean the same thing in a sentence, or there's an even bigger word that I can't hardly pronounce, pleonasm, which is rhetorical repetition that is grammatically superficialist. If you are managing and you're not adaptive, you're not managing. There is good management and there's bad management. And I just think we ought to leave it at management. You know, we are the Society for Range Management, not the Society for Adaptive Range Management. And our journal is Rangeland Ecology and Management, not Rangeland Ecology and Adaptive Management. I will say, though, that when we went from the Journal of Range Management to Rangeland Ecology and Management, there were two sides within the society arguing whether we ought to have management in there anymore. In my opinion, thankfully, we kept that word management. I think it's important. Well, grazing management, again, they're the activities of a business to achieve a defined goal. And I think that there's four. In fact, everybody that writes on this really says that there's four management activities. So number one is stocking rate. Next is the species of the grazer. And then I rank season of grazing, and we'll talk about this more in distribution. They're basically the same. You can't change the season of grazing if you don't change the distribution of the livestock. But they're we consider them differently, but as I was working on this talk, it hit me finally that those are really the same thing, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So let's talk about each one of those. Stocking rate, this is called the Jones-Sandlin model, and if you haven't heard about that, it's a classic piece of research, and basically it says that if you can keep putting animals up to a certain level without changing the performance of that individual animal, and eventually it declines to zero. The dotted line is a relationship that just follows mathematically from the solid line. And so nobody, I think, would argue with me that, you know, you can have a certain level of stocking and you put another cow out there and everybody does the same. But eventually you put enough out there and there's average daily gain goes down or the weaning weight goes down. And eventually you get down to this, where they all die, right? I mean, you can envision the pasture so overgrazed there's no feed left and they die. And so that's, you know, that is our classic stocking rate belief. And the whole profession of range management began due to overgrazing on rangelands. We recognize, you know, I mean, this actually, we don't see this anymore. but that actually used to happen, okay? And it also, as you can imagine, severely degraded the ranges. And so our profession was really started to, before we, I think, had a real appreciation of what overgrazing really was and what the proper stocking rates were. And but now I would argue that we understand that. Nobody, I mean, some people, I know a guy that he does very intensive rotational grazing. And what's really interesting about him, every time you go see him, and we go have tours at his place, right? And the first thing he does is he apologizes and says, I know this place looks bad. You know, it's been dry and I needed to sell animals, but I didn't. He knows he's overgrazing. He's hoping he's going to get the right grazing system, and eventually it'll go away. But he's got to really sell animals, and until he does, he's not going to fix the problem. But as a profession, we have a lot of information out there about stocking rates, and I think we really know what the basic carrying capacity of most of our rangelands are, and I say that that's not an issue anymore. And this is just a little bit, some demonstration. The Sonora Research Station was established in 1916. Back about the turn of the last century, of the century before this one, in that area, about 100 animal units per section was considered the appropriate stocking rate. And you can see when the station was established, it was up about 90. And see what's happened over time. Basically, it's dropped down to around 25, and in recent years been more variable. This is just New Mexico BLM data. You know, we know on all public lands stocking rates have been decreased. And that's primarily because we realized that what we thought was carrying capacity 100 years ago, experience has shown us is not really the carrying capacity of those areas. And this is really interesting to me. This is a watershed that's north of San Angelo, Texas, where I'm from. And this is the runoff per millimeter of rainfall. And the point being is, look, it's dropped over time. Okay? Why did it drop? Huh? More litter. That's more ground cover. We know there's a relationship between, there is some of that in there, but because there's sometimes so in 1970 we had a big flood. There's certain instances, if you get a big enough rain in one period, it doesn't matter what's on the ground. You're going to just saturate everything. You have a lot of runoff. But by and large, what it shows is that as you get more vegetative cover, you have less runoff. There's a well-established relationship between amount of cover and runoff. And so my point is, this shows how stocking rate in that watershed has declined over time, and how we've got more vegetative cover. So again, I'm simply arguing that the stocking rate question has been settled. That doesn't mean everybody does it right, but when they do it wrong, they know better. But here, I would argue, is the real stocking rate issue. It's, you know, here's the line we talked about, but the reality is there's no average years. And so one year, you know, the stocking rate may, you know, the proper stocking rate could be up here, and the next year it's down there, and that may be 50% lower than it was the year before. And so if we're not looking at how people adaptively, how people adapt their stocking rate to the current precipitation, that's the issue, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And so at the end of the day, the variable carrying capacity challenge requires flexibility with the stocking rate. We have to be flexible, and if we don't have those rules, or, you know, if we compare, I've seen some studies where people compare, say, rotational grazing to continuous grazing, and they say, well, the rotational was better, or perhaps worse. And I'm talking about comparing this within commercial enterprises, but when they say, well, the stocking rate on average was the same. Well, if one of them kept an average stocking rate every year, and the other varied over the years, that's not the same. Do you understand that? That keeping the same number of animals year after year so that you had the same average stocking rate as another enterprise that varied it over the years, that's not the same. And the one that varies it should be the more productive enterprise. So species of livestock. So that was the first one, right? Stocking rate. Number one most important thing. Number two is species of livestock. If you look at the literature on multi-species grazing, on average, when you add sheep to a cattle operation, you can increase overall production 24%. When you add cattle to a sheep operation, on average, you can increase it about 10%. Sometimes it actually goes down because sheep are biologically more efficient than cattle. But the reason in general we can do better by having multi-species grazing is simply that our different livestock species have different dietary preferences. Cows eat more grass, sheep more forbs, goats more shrubs. There's differences in selectivities. Cows are lowly selective, so even when sheep and cattle are eating on the same plant, the sheep may be eating a different portion of that plant than the cattle, and then they use different parts of the topography differently. So cattle tend to hang out in the riparian areas, and goats try to find the highest place. Actually, sheep go to the highest place in the pasture, and goats climb the tree on the highest place in the pasture, right? So, an interesting study was done in England where they had clover ryegrass pastures and so they weren't monocultures, but they were nearly a monoculture, and they still got a 10% increase in carrying capacity by running sheep and cattle together, and that was because the sheep would graze over a cow dung patch that would grow up high, but the cattle wouldn't graze over their own dung patches. So anyway, those differences in their selectivity and stuff we know can lead to increased production. And this is just an example of how those things happen. Here's a pasture that has goats in it, and here's an exclosure. This is at the Sonora Experiment Station. And this is cedar, or juniper. And where the goats can get out there and graze it, you can see it's not out in that pasture, but inside this exclosure it gets established and grows. And it tends to grow along these fences that form the exclosure, because that's where the birds roost, and the birds like to eat the juniper berries, and you know where they end up, where they roost, right? And that's where they get established. This isn't showing up too well, but this is just your classic sheep leafy spurge fence line contrast, right? Leafy spurge inside the fence and no leafy spurge outside. That's what multi-species grazing can do for you. But we also know that there's a lot of constraints on it. There's labor constraints, predators, prices, conflicts with wildlife, lifestyles, and so I know you're not going to go get sheep, unfortunately. You should have some sheep and goats. You're not going to do it. I accept that. And so, but I can't not speak to you and tell you ought to. Okay? It's like stocking rate. You may know you're overstocked. You also need to know you need sheep and goats, whether you decide to run them or not. So let's talk about distribution. And like I said, distribution and season of grazing cannot be separated. So here's a rotational grazing cell. And the reason I say that is when we put animals over here, they're not in the rest of the cell, right? And whether that season is a day or two long, or whether it means that they don't get back around here for a month later, or if we have a small, less intense where we have, say, two pasture switchback, and maybe there are 3 months in each one. The point is, we can't have, you just can't separate the two. Once you restrict the distribution of animals, then you're automatically affecting the season that things are being grazed, and there's some good things about that. There's some good things about deferment at different seasons. The only thing that, and I'm not going to talk about this, there are other ways such as low moisture molasses blocks, water, and different ways of affecting distribution as well. But basically, when we think distribution, we classically think about using fence to distribute the animal. And in fact, if you think about it, perhaps the greatest invention that ever affected range science was the barbed wire, right? I mean, that's also how we control stocking rate with barbed wire, right? And the interesting thing, though, all the technology, we use a lot of different technology, but we never get it till after everybody else has had it for a while. And so in 1860, several years before the barbed wire was patented, 150 tons of wire were used in hoop skirts. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. So again, let's talk about season. Is this distribution or is this season of grazing? This picture is taken at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station, been published on several times, and this pasture is grazed in the spring, and this pasture is grazed in the fall. That's arrowleaf balsam root. So when you defer grazing in the spring, when the arrowleaf balsam root is developing and stuff, you can get an awful lot of it, right? But again, is that season of grazing or distribution? They're the same in a sense. And in fact, I could argue that's a rotational grazing system, right? And it's kind of a long term, but I would also, people argue that rotational grazing hasn't really affected the ecological condition of pastures very much. We don't have much research on that. And that's correct when that research was done specifically within the confines of some sort of rotational grazing system. But again, I'll argue that this was a rotational grazing system, but it was published as a season of grazing study. But again, I argue you can't differentiate the two. So let's talk about this grazing systems controversy. How many people out here are aware that there's been this controversy going on? Well, it's been going on for a long time, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But I'm going to talk about it since about 1980, okay? Are you all aware of that? I mean, I know if you're a land manager, you are. What about the students? Has Keith talked to you about that yet? Well, he ought to. Next week's pop quiz, huh? Okay. Better take notes. Okay, so I'm going to call this the current controversy, it goes back farther, but I would argue that in the 80s, we started doing short duration research because Alan Savory came over to the U.S. and he was promoting short duration grazing at double stocking rate. And so basically what he was advertising is it's cheaper to buy a bunch of wire than it is to buy another ranch, right? And so you put in these grazing cells and you can double your stocking rate. And I would argue, and so that research was done in New Mexico. People like Jerry Holacek, Texas. There's a number of different people. I mentioned Rod Heitschmidt. There's several different. Bill Dahl up at Tech did work on that. There's just a number of people doing research in short duration grazing in Texas. And up in Wyoming, Dick Hart was doing a lot of research on short duration grazing. But that was kind of where the work was being done. And really the issue wasn't so much about rotational grazing per se, I would argue. It was about does rotational grazing increase carrying capacity so much that you can double stocking rate or even increase it 50% or 25%, I think people recognize, because up to that point, we had done a lot of research on different rotations. Again, in Texas, the Merrill 3-herd 4-pasture, very popular system, and widely promoted and widely used, That's a fairly low-intensive rotational grazing. But there was work on the high intensity, low frequency, which although it adversely affected animal performance, did tend to give good range response when you had degraded rangelands. Well, I would argue, so after the 80s, that research was done and people were pretty satisfied. No, you can increase stocking rate, and they kind of forgot about it, moved on to other things. Well, then in around 2005, we started the controversy, and in my opinion, it really came from the people in Oklahoma and Kansas were doing this patch burn grazing, and they were getting, they thought, very good results with it. But what they saw was the agencies, particularly NRCS, was given a lot of EQIP money for cross-fencing, for rotational grazing, and not looking at other conservation practices, particularly as they related to grazing management. And so they said, you know, there's no evidence out there that rotational grazing has any value. Now, the people that work for NRCS would argue with you, because what was their experience? They had seen a lot of places that they had helped people develop conservation plans on, grazing management plans on, and that they had improved in condition. And I think they were right. But as you'll recall, when we started this talk, we talked about research being systematic. And what they don't know is, was that because they adjusted their stocking rate? Is that because they did other improvement practices? Was it the fence that did it, the rotational grazing? It was all pretty much confounded. But the thing that NRCS funded and the thing that they really helped manage was that grazing system. And so the one thing I'm certain of is that they saw improved range condition and that was real. And I know they believed in their heart that it was because of rotational grazing, but I would argue we really don't know. It could have been, but we don't really know. And so just to kind of sum up what, going back to the earlier research in the 80s on the stocking rate issue and stuff, Sanford in 1983 wrote a book, and in it he said, and this is true, American graziers and scientists have become obsessed with implementing grazing rotations. Part of that's because we were looking at grazing for production purposes, primarily. And we were looking at a way to increase carrying capacity by rotational grazing. and so we didn't know anything else to do, really, you know. And anyway, there was a lot of research done up until, you know, about the 90s, and then most of that has stopped since then. And then Valentine, in his book, Grazing Management, published in 1990, he said the hypothesis that a grazing system can largely negate the need for stress on the other basic principles of grazing management, proper intensity, which is his way of saying stocking rate, season, kind or mix of animals, and distribution of grazing is untenable. So he reviewed all the literature up to there and basically said that, you know, that the grazing system doesn't negate the rest of the management. And just to emphasize the stocking rate issue, this is the latest issue of Rangelands. It's about strategic grazing management for complex creative systems. And basically all the authors in there are saying that rotational grazing is a pretty darn good thing. You ought to do a little bit more of it. But the interesting thing is half of them that addressed the topic said the number one thing is, this might be on a test, guys, the number one thing is stocking rate. That's right. One of them said stocking rate is the most important factor affecting the results of a grazing management program. Another article said when stocking rate is wrong, applying all other grazing management tools only forestalls the inevitable. And this is a good one. This is Sid Goodloe. Sid was one of the early adopters of short duration grazing in the U.S. He wrote one of the earliest articles on it in Rangelands. And now in this current issue that just came out, he said, Alan and I differ greatly when it comes to stocking rates. And basically, Alan Savory has never backed off the stocking rate, okay? He believes that he believes there's got to be something magical in the hooves of animals, I guess, or the saliva or whatever. I don't know what it is, but, if you graze it, it will grow. That's his belief, okay? And Goodloe is saying, no, there is a proper stocking rate. So, anyway, point being that 80s work, really said that you can't, it is stocking rate, you can do all this other stuff, and now, 2013, we're saying the same thing. We don't make progress very fast, do we? So, I would argue, now, though, we're still arguing about it, okay? Because we just had another issue of Rangelands come out, and it's all devoted to rotational grazing. And it's basically people writing to say that, long story short, Brisky et al. Said this shit's no good, and by God, it is good. And here's why, all right? So we're still arguing about it. And, again, to me, it's the people that were looking at the patch burn graze saying, why can't we get money, EQIP dollars to implement some more advanced management, really, I would argue. So the current, it actually began before 2008 because there were a couple of sessions at the SRM meetings, I think starting in 2006. Is that about right? But this paper came out in 2008 and said basically that the literature on rotational grazing does not support really any advantages of it, rotational grazing per se. Following that, the next year, then there's controversy. There's another issue of Rangelands came out, kind of arguing the pros and the cons, but again, basically saying no. Yeah, we're not saying that Brisky reviewed the literature wrong. We're just saying that the literature is wrong. I think that's what they said. And then in 2011, Brisky et al. Again came back and said, well, there's other things besides rotational grazing per se, and there's a lot of management issues as well. And so, and then here we come to, again, just came out this month, and it was titled Strategic Grazing Management for Complex Creative Systems. One of the things that bothers me about this, particularly the Provenza paper, sometimes we try to make things so complicated. At the end of the day, grazing management it is complicated, but it doesn't have, but you can still do it. You don't have to be Einstein. You don't have to do calculus to know when it's time to open the gate and move the cows, okay? So, now we're going to get deep. Karl Popper, you've all read some of his stuff, right? And he says a theory should be considered scientific if and only if it is falsifiable, okay? In other words, only if you can prove it to be wrong. That you can do 100 projects and they all confirm it, that say rotational grazing worked, or rotational grazing didn't work. Really, that's the issue we were talking about. 100 studies done by scientists that rotational grazing didn't work. It only takes one study that showed it did work to prove them all wrong, right? And that's what Popper says, okay? And I just threw this in because it was just on NPR last week. And, we think we're the only ones with that problem. Well, The hog farmers have found that if you clear out a production facility and sanitize it and clean it before you put new hogs in, you don't have to use antibiotics in their feed. There's no advantage to it. But what are producers doing? They're going, and they found that out. See, what they used to do is they just continually kept adding hogs, and whatever pathogens were in there just got transferred from one cohort to the next, right? Well, now what they do is they move them, they take them from one facility to the next, they clean that facility, they sanitize it, and they have found that they don't need to feed these low-level antibiotics if there's no benefit in terms of hog production. So what do producers do? They do exactly that. They clean the facilities out, they get rid of the old pathogens, and they feed antibiotics. So it's a universal problem, I think. So I'm arguing that really we do need to move beyond this rotational grazing thing. And we're going to talk about the management part of it. But I think really the only two relevant, when it comes to grazing management, the two relevant areas are patch burn grazing and targeted grazing. And in many respects, particularly I'd say the targeted grazing, we know how to do that. We're going to tweak it a little bit and find, certain things, but much of that we kind of know how to do. And it's really a management issue more than anything, more than a research issue. I think on the patch burn grazing, it has not been worked on widely enough and enough different ecosystems to really know how widely it can be applied and be successful. So the management challenge. Standardized performance analysis. Are you all familiar with that? It's a standardized way of economically looking at cow-calf production systems, seeing which ones do better, which ones do worse, and helping increase the efficiency of their production. Just a few of the things, it's been going on for a long time. There's a huge database on this, done in a lot of different states. I know there's some done in Wyoming. The most profitable operators minimize production costs. You can't most people are producing commodities when it comes to livestock. They have to take what the market's going to pay them. They can't do much about that. They can increase the amount they produce, but it costs more money. And basically they found that the most profitable operators minimize that production cost. They typically do it by minimizing the feed cost because that's the biggest production cost. And they do that by using proper grazing management and especially by not overgrazing, because what do you do? How do you fix it once you've overgrazed? You go buy feed, don't you? You go to the feed store, you buy hay. So my point simply is that when the ag economists get involved, they're really saying a lot of the same things we are. Again, in that recent issue of rangelands, Pancho Ortego has an article in there about a ranch he's working on and how they have managed that stocking rate, the flexibility of it, and monitoring. This is Frank and Sims Price. They last year received the Outstanding Rangeland Stewardship Award from the Texas Section Society for Range Management and the Texas Southwest Cattle Raisers Association. Our two organizations give that award together. They've also they won the Region 4 NCDA Environmental Stewardship Award. And I want to talk about them because in the 80s, Frank Price put in cell grazing on all his ranches. And in the 90s, he rolled that fence up. He still rotationally grazes. He just doesn't do it at that intensity. And he will tell you that if nothing else, one of the benefits of rotational grazing is, and he operates probably I'm going to say 40 to 50,000 acres, okay? And it's not all in a contiguous block. I don't have to drive as much to check all my cows, and that's a real advantage. I don't have to check water in 100 pastures. I can do it in 10 pastures, okay? And there's other advantages, but he'll tell you that's probably his number one advantage. And he also, one of his goals is to never buy feed. And so how does he do that? Huh? He never carries that many. Yeah, and when he gets short, I mean, he keeps a low stocking rate all the time. And if it gets really dry, he sells cows. You're exactly right. And that range, if it's lightly grazed, you don't have, and he's minimizing his feed input, right? I want to talk a little bit about something I know something about, which isn't much. But so I mentioned that I managed several different ranches, and I did it for a variety of reasons. And I'm going to talk about this because it shows you that when it comes to management, it's not just grazing management. There's so many different things that if you're managing a ranch, you really have to manage. And this is very complex, but I think we can get through it. The bars are precipitation. The yellow bars are the average precipitation for each month. And this is about a 2-year period, not quite 2 years. The hashed bars are what we actually got. The red is, these are all animal unit equivalents, are sheep. Blue down here is goats, and green are cattle. Now, a little background, 2011 was the driest year on record in Texas. So we went into 12 really dry and really deficient of forage, okay? And these lines up here are basically carrying capacity in a poor year, an average year, and a good year, right? And so this just shows you sheep numbers that varied over time, and they varied primarily because of research needs, but we never got too high because if you look at it, again, we didn't get any rain in April of 2012. We had about average in May. June was about 75% average. July was 25% average, about 75 here. Again, October we're really low. No rain in November of that year. No rain in December to speak of. January was a pretty good rainfall month, but what do you grow in January? Again, February, March, April. April we did pretty good, but we came in a real deficit, and the deficit went back a year before that, okay? My point is, again, you look at the number of animals we had, it was pretty low. But we were worried. We had plans, in fact, in June, we early weaned, but we had no cows. We had gotten rid of those the year before. We've had these goats on there for a little while. I'll tell you a little story here. I already told you that the animal breeders never have enough animals. We have coyote problems on this ranch, and we run guard dogs, and they're smart dogs. They don't like genetic sheep, and they eat them occasionally, I think, or at least the geneticist thinks he does, and so he takes them out of there, right? So, anyway, but this up and down was kind of to accommodate some breeding projects and stuff like that. The goats went out there. A few of them got chewed on, and they went back home. He didn't like that happening. But the point is, so in June, we early weaned a bunch of lambs. We were getting prepared to sell we had what we call kind of commercial ewes, and then we have genetics ewes. And we're going to get rid of everything but about 200, 300 ewes on this 5,000 acre property, okay? And then, look what happened in May. We got 6 inches of rain. We were replacing water gaps. June and July, we got above average in July. Look at August, it's about 50% above average. So what did we do? Well, see how the sheep numbers went down? The reason the sheep numbers went down was, like I said, we got several ranches, right? And I wanted to put cattle on all of them. We actually, this one ranch, we bought 80 heifers and put on it, but we didn't have enough cattle. We didn't have the capital to go buy more, and it was state lease land, and they wouldn't let us sublease out to take stockers on. So we moved all the sheep to that ranch, and we bought stockers, and we went from having about 500 sheep down to having about 200 sheep, and we've got 400 stockers on there right now. Now, they will leave in a month or two. They'll leave no later than January, and that will give that range time to recover and everything else. But my point is, there's a lot of things that go into really managing a ranch that are never captured in a grazing study, okay? But we need to capture that information. But it's not easy, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But I just wanted to give this example to show all the different things that the real rancher has to worry about when they're making these decisions. Because I think our literature typically, well, I know, not typically, it never really addresses this stuff. And so Keith did want me to talk a little bit about monitoring, and you can be very complex and very simple. Frank Price, who I talked about, I've seen his spreadsheets are more complicated than mine. He puts more effort into it. But I keep a simple spreadsheet where every week we enter in the number of animals by class in each pasture. And that tells me, and then I keep a running total. I have a grazing year that's April to March every year of what that stocking rate has been. I can look at that and see, you know, if I'm moving cows or whatever, just where it's been. It's simple. And simple is good. I'll tell you a little story. I work with Butch Taylor, and Butch Taylor has been doing this a long time. And Mort Kothman and Ray Hennett developed a product called the Grazing Manager that if you Google that, you'll find it. You can download it, and it calculates animal demand down to the ounce. Now, I can't measure it down to the ounce on the rangeland, but it'll calculate it for you. And Butch was really a big proponent of this software that did this. It's just a database software that kept track of all the demand of the animals. And that worked really well as long as his secretary, Trevlin, was there and would enter that data, and he had enough people out there to gather the data and do all the work, right? But once she retired and we had budget cut, we couldn't replace her, and we lost some other personnel, and pretty soon it quit happening. So, simple is good. I also track precipitation. I look at it in terms of not only, you know, the lines are the monthly precip, and the bars are the cumulative, and the yellow bars are the actual, and the blue bars are the long-term average. Question: what is the right statistic to use when looking at rainfall? Average or median? Who knows the difference? Yes, Mike. Wrong. Mode is the one that occurs the most often. Median is the level of which half the rainfall events were below and half the rainfall events were above. In San Angelo, Texas, the median rainfall is 20% below the average rainfall. You better manage for the median, okay? I need to tell you one other story. Speaking of that, I got to go back here because this is important. So, now, in addition to wanting to use that forage, I had a real economic reason to do that. How many people here take out pasture range and forage insurance? Well, I know y'all are on the vegetation index, and I feel sorry for you about that. We're on the rainfall index in Texas, and I like that. But I've got a $20,000 insurance bill coming because it rained. Now, that's not a good thing, so you better go make some money. And I'm figuring these cows are making me about $200 a day because I'm getting 50 cents a pound on the game, and I'm hoping they're gaining at least a pound, maybe a pound and a half a day, okay? So that's another management thing that goes into that. And actually, that program is a great program because what it does is it allows you to stock lightly and make as much money in most years, because it's based on the average, and like I said, the median, which is what you really get, is 20% below, and it's also subsidized at a rate of between 51 and 59%. And so bottom line is, it'll pay you to stock light, and when it does rain, you should have plenty of forage to take on some stockers, go buy cows, do something, and pay your premium. And so you ought to make money off the deal. And that's rainfall. And this is the Texas Range Monitoring System. It takes about a six-pack to do a pasture, but it's a good indication of how much forage is out there. We like this system. So in addition to looking at the rainfall, you need to go out and look at your pastures, right? And you know, you don't really have to know if there's 2,000 pounds per acre out there or 2,500. You know if you've got a lot of grass or if you're short, right? And yes, you can practice and clip, and you can actually, validate that, but it's not near as fun as this way. Okay, so now in New Zealand, they wanted to find. How many people think the farmers in New Zealand manage better than we do? I mean, they have these pretty intensive rotational systems. They do a lot of fertilization and all that kind of stuff. This was a really interesting article because first off, it talks about how they don't manage very well. But they took the three top producers there. They were sheep producers, and they followed them around for a couple of years, and they interviewed them about every couple of months. They were trying to make an expert system so that that they could then give this software to the not-so-good managers, and the not-so-good managers, then could use the software and become good managers, right? Well, first off, one of the things they found is these guys only spend an hour a month on the computer anyway, so that probably wasn't going to work very well. But when they did that, let me read this to you. This is kind of a summary of that paper, okay? In summary, it is useful to note conclusions provided by the farmers. They noted the feeding policy is not a simple question. Depends on so many factors. Feeding is a constant juggle. We have no fixed pattern at any stage, and the best rule, there isn't a rule. This says it all, emphasizing the most impossible task of finding decision rules used by superior farmers, which might form the basis of an expert system. In addition, as intimated, the difference between both the physical and personal factors means each situation is unique, making any decision rules that might be used that might be useful for some being inapplicable for others. The conclusion must be that an expert system for feeding decisions is unlikely to be a practical reality, and that farmers very much rely on experience to develop intuition that provides their answers. If the farmer has high managerial ability, his actions will lead to good outcomes. This does not mean certain general principles do not apply, but that general applicable practical action rules are impossible to create through observing farmers. Overall, it does not seem concentrating on improving It does seem concentrating on improving farmers' intuition is likely to confer many more benefits than developing expert systems. Effectively, intuition is each farmer's custom-built expert system suitable to their unique situation, teaching them how to think. That's what you're going to school for, guys. Don't forget that. Okay. Moving right along. So now, this is an interesting fella. Anybody, Nassim Taleb, he's a Lebanese and he is a distinguished professor of risk engineering at the Polytechnical Institute of New York University. I think he graduated from Oxford. He's written 3 books recently. The first one, I think, was called Fooled by Randomness. And then he wrote a book called The Black Swan, which is really taking off on Popper's theory about falsification. And the argument there is until we discovered, and until Europeans discovered Australia, we thought all swans were white. Well, Australia has black swans. So how many thousands of years, when was Australia discovered? In, what, 1800s, 1700s? But for, thousands of years before that, the world only knew that there were white swans. And now there were black swans. So we had a book called Black Swans, and they're about improbable events. And then this book called Anti-Fragile, Things That Gain from Disorder. And what I like about this is he's kind of the Alan Savory of the financial world, I would say, in somewhat. He takes on the establishment like Savory did. Before he got into academia, he was an options trader on the New York Stock Exchange. And anyway, let me read, and he's saying something very similar about commodity traders or options traders as the New Zealanders did, Neufeld, that was his name, did about farmers. And I just think that's kind of an interesting parallel. So let me, bear with me, let me read this. Talib was in a conversation with the chief economist of one of the local exchanges and had to advise him on new, complicated financial products and wanted my opinion, and this person wanted my opinion on these, as I specialized in and had published a textbook of sorts on the so-called very complicated exotic options. These are the options, by the way, that caused the financial crash of 2008. Just put this in perspective. He recognized that the demand for these products was going to be very large, but he wondered how traders could handle these complicated exotics if they did not understand the Gazarnoff theorem. The Gazarnoff theorem is something mathematically complicated that at the time was only known by a very small number of academics. Something hit me then. This is Talib speaking. Something hit me then. Nobody worries that a child ignorant of the various theorems of aerodynamics and incapable of solving an equation of motion would be unable to ride a bicycle. So why didn't he transfer the point from one domain to another? Didn't he realize that these Chicago pit traders respond to supply and demand, little more, to supply and demand and little more in competing to make a buck with no need for the Gazarnoff theorem, any more than a trader of pistachios in Souk of Damascus needs to solve general equilibrium equations to set the price of his product. So in other words, these traders, and if you've ever been around, livestock traders, you know the same thing. They kind of intuitively know what the value of what they're trading is based on experience and based on having lost money on some trades, right? And made some on others. So, this is a takeaway from all of this tonight. Principles of grazing management are well known. Their stocking rate, species of livestock, distribution, and season of grazing, which are inseparable. We know how to work them. There's really not a lot to say about that. We can do it. We may not, but we can do it. Science has shown that most practitioners agree on how to apply these principles, but not everybody does it. Grazing systems are a construct within which grazing management is applied. In other words, you got some pastures out there, now what do you do with them? They do increase management flexibility, and they reduce labor requirements. Strictly speaking, all theories either supporting or refuting grazing systems have been falsified, and therefore the success of grazing management, whether with or without a grazing system, will depend on management. Grazing management may not be quantifiable. Management, right? Therefore, it may not be possible to develop broadly applicable rules of thumb. So this is based on the Talib stuff and the New Zealand study. Good grazing managers develop from experience by reflecting on the consequences of their action to develop an intuition. Further debate on grazing systems per se seems unjustified. The only areas of grazing management with unresolved or searchable questions are patch burn grazing and targeted grazing. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So, questions? Yes? Oh, that's where you go out in the pasture and you leave the livestock in and you burn a patch of it, say 10 to 20% a year. And ultimately, over time, you develop a mosaic of overgrazed areas and undergrazed areas, and it increases the overall heterogeneity of that pasture. And so the argument with those people that believe in that and that have been studying it is that, biological diversity. We all say biological diversity is good. Normal, particularly intensive rotational grazing, is management for homogeneity. We think that they'll all graze the pasture evenly, and they'll come back in a given length of time, and they'll have fresh forage, and it'll all be about the same height. They take it down, and so on. There is heterogeneity because as you go around the grazing system, this pasture's been rested, a month, and this one maybe, 2 months, and so on. But we tend to keep it more homogeneous. The others say that there's advantage of having this heterogeneity. There's also the advantage of being able to use prescribed fire without all of the work that we normally do to rest the pasture, to build up fuel load, and then rest it to recover and all that. So, does that make any sense? You probably don't want to do it. This has been done primarily, like I say, in Oklahoma and Kansas in kind of the tall grass prairie areas. That was that like Flint Hills? Yeah, okay, yeah, right. And that's a different deal too, because it's burned and then it's allowed to grow until it's ready for stock to be turned on. Yeah. And that's a totally different thing. Yeah, absolutely. And how it comes and everything else. But the point is, you can make money taking the insurance out. And if you're a profit maximizer, or even if you're not a profit, nobody's a profit maximizer, but some people like to make money worse than others, right? And so, or some people's budgets have been cut worse than others. And so, yeah. You're right. You're absolutely right. It's a tool that's out there, though, that I would argue has been underutilized for good range management. And I could talk on that for an hour. In fact, I spent all last week figuring the probabilities of how to take because you got to make the decision by Friday. And figuring out what periods I wanted to insure this year, next year, because that's, what would make this insurance really good is instead of taking it out in November for the next year, is take it out in November for last year, and you could do really good at it. But they won't let you do that. Yes, ma'am. And particularly eastern red cedar and some things like that to keep the woody vegetation down. Yes. Yeah. Other questions? Don't be shy. Yes. That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. Because what I think your real question, to me, the real question is, in the future, are we going to be producing is agriculture going to be driven by conservation concerns or production concerns? And there's a really neat book called Meals to Come, and it discusses this, and it looks at the history of basically the Malthusian versus the cornucopian perspective, and we have gone through cycles about since Malthus, which was I think 1473, but I could be wrong, somewhere in there, long time ago anyway. We've gone through about 10 cycles of scientists and society saying, you know, we're either going to be starving to death in the next 10 years, or we've had these commodity programs. When I did my research in the 1980 on forage-fed beef, wheat was $4 a bushel. Gasoline had gone up to, I think, $1 a gallon or something, and that was outrageous back then, right? And we were no longer going to be able to feed grained livestock. That was the consensus of everybody. And then we went to excess, So I don't know the answer. I really don't. But it seems reasonable. There's two things. Number one, it seems reasonable to me at some point, yes, production's got to be more important. But the other side of that is all mature societies are declining in population. So Europe, Russia, Japan, and the only reason the U.S. is not is because of immigration. So that's the other flip side of that. Other questions? Anything online? Well, you can put in a fire line. Either there's a number of ways, but one of the easiest ways is to use a wet line, and so you burn under very mild conditions, high humidity, low temperature, and you have a truck out there that puts that fire out. And then once you've developed a black line around everything, then you can burn inside of it. You can do it mechanically by, plowing the soil or something like that. Yeah. No, it didn't show that in the picture, but there's different ways of doing that. Yeah. Well, I appreciate your attention, and it's been a real pleasure to come here and talk with you. And I'll be around tomorrow. I'll be around this evening, so I'd love to visit with you if you want to do it one-on-one. You're welcome.
Thanks for coming tonight. Appreciate your time. We got about 95 folks there, so that was a great turnout. So, any other questions? John will be around for a little bit, or anything about the society. We'll be glad, several of us here, that we could talk to you about the Society for Range Management. So, thanks for coming.